Hello, everyone. Welcome to Sleeping Night, where darkness hides incredible stories.
In the cramped, labyrinthine heart. In the cramped, labyrinthine heart of a town built long before any sense of order overtook its streets, there stood a workshop so unassuming that most travelers could easily stride past it without a second thought. The buildings around it leaned inward as if pressing close to eavesdrop on secrets, their crooked beams and slanting roofs smothering the daylight that ever dared to intrude. Amid such intimate clutter, this particular shop could have vanished entirely were it not for the sign that hovered above its door. It was a wooden clock, carved years ago by a craftsman of little repute, and its painted hands had long ago ceased to mark time. They pointed always to the same stroke of midnight, no matter how many times the town's bell tolled outside. Children whispered that the clock's gears turned backward at dusk, and old women crossed themselves before walking past it after dark. Inside, the shop was even smaller than it appeared from the street. Shelves crowded the walls, each buckling under the weight of half-repaired devices. Cuckoo clocks with silent birds, music boxes that played only the first and last notes, watches that skipped a tick for every minute they gained. The air was thick with the metallic tang of oil and springs, laced with an odor faintly sweet and unfamiliar. Despite its oddities, or perhaps because of them, the clockmaker's shop had a steady stream of visitors. Some came with heartfelt hope, clutching heirlooms that no longer ticked in time with the world. Others came out of idle curiosity, drawn by the stories that clung to the shop like dust. For all who lingered, there was an unspoken understanding that this place was both a sanctuary and a puzzle, where time could be lost, found, or if you believed the stories, briefly forgotten. The townspeople called it, with equal parts reverence and resignation, the clockmaker's shop. The clockmaker himself was a cipher. He kept odd hours, appearing as if conjured from the shadows when the sky was neither day nor night. Always he wore a black waistcoat that hung too loose on his narrow frame, and his thin, pale hands moved with a precision that unsettled even the most practical of his customers. Some said he never slept, that his eyes were rimmed red from counting the seconds as they slipped away. Others said he had no family, that the shop was both his home and his inheritance. He spoke little. When he did, it was with a voice so quiet that you found yourself leaning in, compelled by the gravity of his words. Only one thing united all the stories about the clockmaker: the conviction that he understood machines better than he understood people, and that his own heart beat to a rhythm no human could quite match. And yet, when he worked, there was something almost tender in the way he touched the broken gears and delicate filaments. He handled each piece as though it were a secret entrusted to him alone, and his workshop became a kind of chapel for lost causes. On this particular morning, as the fog still curled between the cobblestones, the clockmaker was already at his bench, hunched over a pocket watch that refused to be made whole. The town wore its ordinariness like a well-patched cloak. By day, the market square overflowed with haggling and hollering, merchants brandishing bruised vegetables or bolts of rough cloth, their voices as sharp as the knives at the butcher's stall. Delivery carts clattered over the stones, their drivers cursing at dogs and children alike. The children, for their part, slipped like minnows through the tangled legs of grown-ups, always just out of reach, trailing shouts and laughter behind them. Some played at war, others at marriage, and a few with a crueler bent orchestrated games in which a scapegoat was chased, caught, and mock-exiled from the group, always to be stealthily welcomed back, for the town's children could not abide true loneliness. Each Sunday, the priest presided over a congregation that squirmed in pews, worn smooth by generations of uneasy penance. He spoke not so much to their souls as to their superstition, his sermons a litany of warnings and veiled threats, obedience, humility. Only in these, he insisted, would the townsfolk find deliverance from the unnamed malaise that haunted even the sunniest afternoons. For all his sternness, the priest was not above gossip, and it was said that he himself had once delivered a broken clock to the workshop. After hours under a hooded cloak, as if seeking absolution from time itself. Yet beneath the rhythm of commerce and ritual, there thrummed another, stranger cadence. It was not the mechanical chime of the town bell, nor the predictable crow of roosters in the morning. Rather, it was a faint pulse, a ticking so subtle that some doubted their own senses. But it was there, always there, haunting the silences between footsteps and spoken words, giving shape to the emptiness of the night. During festivals, when music and laughter spilled into the lanes and people swayed in torchlight, the ticking was drowned out, replaced by the more familiar tempo of human indulgence. But after the last casks were drained and the torches sputtered down to coals, the children would press their ears to the floorboards and swear they could hear it, relentless and certain as fate. Neighbors in the houses nearest the clockmaker's shop suffered most. By day, they tried to ignore the sensation, dismissing it as some quirk of plumbing or a relic of old timber settling in the walls. At dusk, though, when the world turned languid and the streets emptied, the ticking grew bold. It insinuated itself into their dreams, so that housewives woke in the dark with the certainty that their own hearts had skipped a beat, and old men muttered that it was an omen, a counting down of days left to them. There were stories, of course. There are always stories in such towns. Some whispered that the clockmaker was in league with shadowy patrons, beholden to a schedule older and more rigid than the town's own. Others, less fanciful but no less anxious, said that if the ticking ever stopped, the very fabric of the place would unravel and the streets would collapse into a hush too deep to ever lift again. On fog-thick mornings, when the town's outlines faded and even the market seemed a rumor, the ticking was at its most insistent. Shopkeepers opening their shutters would pause, squinting into the gloom, trying to pinpoint the source. But the sound was everywhere and nowhere, a pressure at the edge of hearing. And always, inevitably, their gazes would slide toward the shop where the wooden clock above the door pointed to eternal midnight, and the sign in the window glimmered like a promise or a threat. Inside that dim, close space, the clockmaker sat at his bench, hunched in wordless communion with the open pocket watch before him. The gas lamp guttered overhead, its blue-orange flame barely a tremor in the half-light. The man himself was a study in economy. Spine bowed, elbows tight to his ribs, the thinness of his body giving the impression of a figure cut from black paper and stuck against the pale clutter of the wall. His spectacles were perched not on the bridge of his nose, but just above it, and he peered beneath them the way a hawk might peer over the edge of a wind-blown nest, indifferent to the world outside the warped glass of his shopfront. His hands never stopped. Tweezers, picks, and minuscule screwdrivers moved with a dexterity that would have made a jeweler envious, manipulating springs so delicate that the breath of a careless apprentice would have scattered them into oblivion. He listened, not to the town's anxious chorus, that distant pulse of commerce and suspicion, but to the secret, stuttering confession of the gears between his fingers. The watch trembled under his scrutiny, its heart laid bare. every failure exposed and accounted for. He was not a cruel interrogator, though. The clockmaker handled each mechanism as if it were a patient with a case history only he could interpret. A sufferer whose affliction could be named and, with luck, remedied. His was the rarest kind of attention. Unhurried, absolute, and unblinking, even as the world around him blurred and wheeled from one hour to the next. Everyone knew the clockmaker. He had lived in the town for as long as anyone could remember, and those who claimed to recall his youth invariably contradicted each other on the details. Some insisted he had arrived in the aftermath of a great fire, bringing with him nothing but a battered valise and a voice like the last tick of a dying watch. Others said he had simply always been there, as if the town and the clockmaker were twin phenomena, one emerging from the other in a tangle of cause and effect. He was an elderly man with skin like old parchment, a blade-keen nose, and the kind of eyes that never seemed surprised by anything, not even the return of someone long thought dead. For all that, he was never unkind, and there were children who swore that if you stood very still in his shop, you could hear the ticking of his own heart, perfectly regular and utterly silent. He could repair any mechanism, whether a carriage clock or the great bells of the town hall, whose ponderous clang once fell silent for an entire fortnight until the clockmaker was summoned to ascend the rickety ladder and minister to the tower's stubborn innards. But lately, other rumors had begun to spread, accumulating in the margins of polite conversation. These were the stories that started as a joke or a dare, only to accrue the sticky residue of belief. People whispered that he could repair more than just machines. It began, as such things do, with a small, almost invisible oddity. The grocer's daughter had a stutter. Nothing serious, just a hiccup of the tongue that grew worse whenever she was nervous. Her father brought in the household clock for cleaning, and when he returned to collect it, the clockmaker lingered a moment before presenting the polished case. "Your daughter," he said, in that soft, measured tone. "Does she have trouble with speech?" The grocer had blinked, surprised. "Nothing to fret over," he replied, but the clockmaker only nodded and handed over the clock. The next morning, the girl's stutter was gone. Her father, when pressed by his wife, could only recall the clockmaker's hands, so gentle and assured, and the faint, bitter scent of oil that lingered on the clock's restored chime. Children were always the most susceptible to stories. It was they who first noticed that, after Mrs. Duval's son recovered from his fever, he never again lost his temper or raised his voice, not even when his little brother flushed his favorite toy soldier down the privy. And it was the children who dared each other to sneak into the shop after hours, to see if the clockmaker would fix something inside them too. Once a pack of them crept in during the dusk, their pockets stuffed with broken toys. A wind-up horse, a tin soldier with a limp, a music box that played only funeral marches. The clockmaker was waiting for them, as if he had anticipated their arrival to the minute. "You have all brought me something broken," he said, his gaze sweeping over their faces. "But you must be sure before you ask me to mend it." None of them could later recall what passed between them in that murky hour, only that they left with their toys whole and their hearts slightly heavier, as if a piece of themselves had been quietly rewound. Adults, being more circumspect, rarely spoke of miracles in daylight. But there were those who, on sleepless nights, found themselves staring at the ceiling and wondering if the clockmaker could ease the chronic ache in a hip, or the sudden pallor that came over a mother's face after the umpteenth stillbirth. There were always plausible explanations: medicine, luck, the resilience of the young. But the clockmaker's legend grew in the spaces between these explanations, in the moments when logic failed and something stranger rushed in to fill the void. Then there was the case of old Mr. Corbin, the cobbler, whose hand tremors had grown so bad he could no longer thread a needle. "Just nerves," the doctor said, and prescribed tinctures that stained Corbin's tongue but did nothing for his hands. In desperation, his wife brought one of the cobbler's ancient clocks to the shop, along with a sack of battered shoes for repair. The clockmaker accepted the goods without comment, but when Mrs. Corbin returned a week later, she found her husband at his bench, humming a snatch of song and resoling a boot with fingers steadier than they had been in years. The shoes, for their part, bore a stiffness around the heel, as if the leather had been reinforced with something old and unyielding. These stories, true or not, became the secret currency of the town, passed from mouth to ear with the same mixture of fear and hope that accompanied all things unexplainable. And with each telling, the clockmaker's shop grew stranger in the imagination, a place where the boundaries between mechanism and flesh, between cause and effect, thinned to the width of a hairspring. On this particular morning, though, the clockmaker noticed none of the gossip swirling outside his door, nor was he troubled by the footsteps that stopped and started along the street, or the faces that sometimes pressed close to the glass, peering in as if hoping to witness a transgression. Instead, he sat utterly absorbed in the anatomy of the watch before him, a battered silver timepiece with a cracked dial and a history of bad luck. Its owner, a young woman who worked in the bakery across the square, had entrusted it to him with a look that was almost a challenge. "It belonged to my father," she'd said, "and every time I try to wind it, it skips ahead, like it's running away from me." The clockmaker had nodded, as though her words matched exactly the diagnosis he'd already intuited. Now, as he coaxed the mainspring into alignment, he murmured to the instrument in a language only he and the broken things could understand. Somewhere in the deep tangle of the shop, the hour struck. He set down the tweezers and tested the hands, which circled the face with a hush like moth wings. Satisfied, he closed the case, buffed away the fingerprints, and set the watch on a velvet square by the register. Outside, the fog was beginning to lift, and the world returned in increments. The squawk of gulls at the river, the distant grind of a cartwheel, the bellows of a child denied some coveted treat. He waited, as he always did, for the next knock on the door. While he sat among the measured clutter of his domain, the outside world spun 1,000 conjectures about the work that transpired within. Old men on the church steps speculated in stage whispers about the true extent of the clockmaker's talent, whether he could, in secret, bring back the dead or turn a heart of malice to honey with a single twist of the wrist. Women in the market eyed the clock tower as if it were a weather vane for their own fortunes, and children wove stories of the clockmaker's magic into games played along the gutters and alleys. Some pointed to the baker's apprentice, who had once been sullen and slow, but now swept the storefront each dawn with clockwork precision and a smile that never slipped, not even when pelted with cruel jests about his new demeanor. Others told of the midwife's husband, who had gone to the workshop stooped and grumbling with arthritis, but returned the next day upright and brisk, his voice retuned to a frequency that vibrated the glassware in his own kitchen. And yet, for all the talk of miracles, there was a growing unease. Neighbors watched each other with an intensity that bordered on suspicion. It began with the smallest things. A butcher who suddenly remembered every customer's name, even those he'd never met before. A schoolmaster who, after a single visit to the shop, corrected the town's children with the unfailing accuracy of a pendulum, and never once raised his voice. No one dared say it aloud, but in back rooms and after hours, the word unnatural began to pepper conversations once reserved for weather and politics. Most unsettling of all were the anecdotes that could not be explained away by the everyday churn of human life. There was the case of Alma Pryor, who had suffered from fainting spells her entire adolescence. When her mother, desperate and exhausted, brought the family's broken mantel clock to the shop, the clockmaker accepted it with his usual air of gentle resignation. Within a week, Alma ceased to swoon. Instead, she developed a strange habit of pausing mid-sentence, eyes blank and unfocused, before resuming as if nothing had happened. Her friends joked that she was catching up, but her mother worried, and Alma herself took to biting her nails, methodically, down to the quick. Rumors compounded. A young couple, newly married, was seen walking by the river each evening at precisely the same time, their footsteps synchronized in a way that unsettled even the most pragmatic observer. A dog that had once barked at everything, shadows, strangers, its own reflection, now sat silently at its owner's heel, tail wagging with metronomic regularity. The baker's apprentice, whose transformation had been the first to raise eyebrows, could now recite the entirety of the town's census from memory, though he claimed not to know how or why he did it. People began to wonder what, exactly, the clockmaker was winding up inside them. Still, the stream of customers never ceased. The desperate and the curious alike climbed the steps to his door, clutching their packages and their broken burdens. The clockmaker treated each with the same unwavering courtesy, his manner as constant as the tick that haunted the walls. But he noticed, because he noticed everything, that the repairs were becoming harder, the fractures deeper, the gears more stubborn. Sometimes, when he bent over a particularly recalcitrant watch, he felt the weight of those stories pressing in from the fog outside. He wondered, fleetingly, if perhaps the town itself was winding down, and only he could keep it from grinding to a halt. A blind man, living out his last years in the chilly attic of the rectory, reported that, after the clockmaker took apart and reassembled his grandfather's ornate carriage clock, he could hear colors, the voices in the market shouting in garish reds, and the river's murmur running a low, mournful blue. The local nursemaid's chronic headache vanished overnight after the clock in her sick room underwent a simple cleaning. Her grateful employer noted that, while the child in her care now slept uninterrupted through the night, the nursemaid herself had developed a tendency to tap her teeth together, counting out invisible seconds with a rigor that left her lips bloodless and raw. A retired schoolmistress, long revered for her wit and poisoned tongue, visited the shop to repair a pocket watch inscribed with her maiden initials. Within a fortnight, her gossiping ceased altogether, not from lack of opportunity, but from what her friends described as a serene and total disinterest in the lives of others. She walked the lanes with her hands clasped behind her back, eyes fixed forward, her former victims left to wonder whether her silence was a blessing or a curse. In every case, the transformations were subtle at first, then grew unmistakable. A boy who had limped since birth, his joints warped by fever, was returned to near-perfect motion after a visit to the clockmaker. He ran so smoothly down the street that children called him the cartwheel, spinning circles around his playmates until their parents forbade them from joining in. The town's midwife, famous for delivering babies with a laugh and a bawdy joke, returned from the shop with her own timepiece fully restored. Thereafter, she moved through her duties with a severity that chilled her clients, never offering more than a brief, clinical smile at the birth of a child. The townfolk began to tally these corrections, as if logging the evidence of some invisible hand remaking them all. Yet, for every account of miraculous healing, there were reports of new and inexplicable habits. The grocer's wife, whose migraines had plagued her for decades, now covered every surface in their home with doilies, each one perfectly identical, their patterns never once misaligned. The miller, once a slow and careful man, now finished his work hours before anyone else in the district. But when pressed for conversation, he repeated himself, phrase for phrase, as if reading from a script written into the grain of his bones. Even the dogs and cats of the town responded to the change. The mongrel that haunted the bakery stoop, formerly a yowler and a thief, now sat perfectly still, head cocked to one side, eyes following the hands of the clockmaker's apprentices as they swept the walk clean of crumbs. None of this went unremarked. Rather, it was catalogued and compared, weighed and measured in hushed tones. The townspeople observed each other with the wary reverence accorded to the newly converted or the newly possessed. Days passed with the slow certainty of a pendulum's arc, each hour marked by a swelling sense of anticipation, as if they awaited the next adjustment or repair. Even those who had not sought the clockmaker's services felt the pull of his influence. They found themselves waking at identical times each morning, stopping what they were doing at the precise chime of the church bell, or rearranging the jars on their shelves until each was equidistant from the next. The clockmaker himself seemed immune to the fervor he inspired. He greeted every visitor with the same mild bow, his hands always in motion, always busy with the next broken thing. Yet even he could not escape scrutiny. People watched for some evidence of his own humanity, a frayed cuff, a misplaced word, a moment of distraction, but he offered none. In the rare moments he stepped out into the square, he surveyed the town as if checking the works of some grand and delicate machine, looking for the one piece that might slip out of place. Children, ever the most honest observers of their own kind, began to play games that mimicked the clockmaker's craft. They assigned roles to each other, gears, springs, hands, and marched in formation around the fountain, arms stiff and faces blank. "Wind me up," they demanded, and when obliged, performed their strange procession until the town's mothers called them in for supper. At first, the game was a joke, a parody of adult fears. But soon, the children took to freezing in place at odd moments, eyes glazed and limbs locked, waiting for an invisible signal to start again. Rumors changed, as rumors do, growing ever darker. Some said that those most thoroughly fixed by the clockmaker could be found in the church at midnight, sitting in rows, unmoving and silent, their faces illuminated by the faint, golden glow of the altar lamp. Others swore that the old man who swept the town hall steps, once a notorious drunk, hadn't blinked in 3 weeks, and that if you stood close enough, you could hear a faint ticking beneath the skin of his wrist. These tales were never spoken above a whisper, and only after glancing over one's shoulder, for there was a sense that the very walls might carry word of dissent back to the clockmaker's shop. And yet no one could deny the peace that had settled over the town. Quarrels ended before they began. Accidents ceased. Children were born healthy, and the elderly lingered in comfort rather than pain. Even the crops, which had for years yielded only enough to scrape by, now flourished under the steady rhythm of communal labor. The unspoken agreement was that this was, on balance, a good thing. That a little oddness was a small price to pay for the easing of suffering. Still, there were those who remembered the world before the clockmaker set up shop, and they clung to their imperfections with a stubbornness bordering on pride. The old grocer, his stutter returned, would not part with a single clock from his shelves, no matter how many times they ran down or stopped. The baker's youngest daughter wore her chipped tooth like a badge of honor, refusing her mother's pleas to get it sorted. When asked why, she shrugged and said, "I like the way it feels." One man, a former soldier with a crooked smile and a face half ruined by shrapnel, made a point of limping past the clockmaker's window every morning, his gait defiant, his cane rapping out an irregular beat. He would nod to the clockmaker if they made eye contact, and sometimes, just to make a point, he would let himself fall out of step with the rest of the town, dragging one foot behind the other until it drew stares. But these outliers were few, and their resistance only emphasized the prevailing order. Over time, the boundaries between the natural and the engineered, between cure and correction, grew increasingly difficult to define. The clockmaker's influence seeped into everything: the way people greeted each other on the street, the way the market stalls were laid out, the very cadence of the town's breathing. Even the river seemed to flow more steadily, its tides obeying the invisible tempo set by a man in a dim, cluttered room. No one dared speak of it openly, not in the bakery with its row upon row of bread so precisely arrayed it looked more like architecture than sustenance, nor in the queue outside the grocer, where the bells above the door chimed in time with the ticking in every home. Not even in the shadowed corners of the public house, where a generation ago men had shouted politics and curses over their empty mugs, but now sat in uneasy silence, measuring their words as carefully as a draftsman might measure glass. The balance was too delicate, too complete. To wonder aloud about the source of the town's new order was to risk shattering it, like rapping a knuckle against a crystal goblet, just to hear the sound. In place of speech, the townspeople adopted a series of glances, shrugs, and silent understandings. They communicated in subtext, in the tilt of a chin or the way a hand lingered on a windowsill just a moment too long. Every household maintained at least one timepiece, most several, and though no one ever mentioned it, the hour was always known, always discussed in exact numbers, but never in meaning. Life became a choreography, and everyone seemed to know the steps, even those who claimed to despise dancing. The clockmaker's shop grew into a kind of axis mundi. People orbited it, their errands and appointments aligning themselves to the gentle pulse of its hours. The square in front of the shop was swept clean each morning by the old man who had not blinked in 3 weeks, his broom moving with unfailing precision. On Mondays, the fruit seller would set up her crates exactly 4 paces from the shop's stoop. On Wednesdays, the flower vendor placed his buckets directly opposite, their blooms nodding in silent obeisance to the clockwork that governed the air. The shop itself never closed, because the clockmaker never seemed to sleep. His silhouette could be glimpsed at any hour, bent above his bench, hands moving in the pale lamplight with the economy of a surgeon and the devotion of a priest. Even the seasons changed with mechanical predictability. Spring arrived on the last possible day of March, bringing with it a flourish of crocuses and the sound of children's laughter, meted out in even regular doses. Summer's heat unfurled itself precisely at noon on the solstice, and by the 1st of September, not a single leaf remained on the town's trees, all gathered up in neat piles awaiting the sweepers. Rain fell in scheduled intervals, never lasting more than the allotted hour, and snow, when it came, was so perfectly distributed that not a single rooftop bore more than its fair share. Birthdays, funerals, weddings, all observed with an efficiency that bordered on the miraculous. The town calendar kept immaculate by the clockmaker's apprentice, whose penmanship was envied by the region. This was, in most respects, a paradise of order, and for those who recalled the decades of famine, war, and plague, it was a kind of salvation. Yet beneath the surface ran a current of unease, a sense that something vital had been exchanged for all this harmony. Children no longer invented games. They played only those that could be given rules, and their laughter, though frequent, came in near identical bursts. The market never haggled, the harvest never failed, and the sick room's bell, once a constant in every home, had not rung in months. People wondered privately what might happen if the clocks all stopped at once. The very act of wondering felt illicit, and those who indulged in such thoughts found themselves glancing over their shoulders, half expecting to see the clockmaker's eyes upon them. There were, inevitably, new arrivals to the town. Travelers and traders, drawn by the rumors of prosperity or simply blown off course by the whims of fate, would pause at the edge of the square, sniff the air, and sense immediately that something was different. Some left within days, unnerved by the unblinking order. Others stayed, seduced by the ease of life in a place where everything worked as it should. Over time, even the most skeptical found themselves falling into step. It was, after all, easier to adapt than to resist. The clockmaker's influence was not so much enforced as it was gravitational. What began as an oddity became a comfort, then a necessity, and finally, a kind of faith. It was in this state of equilibrium that the town found itself, neither wholly content nor capable of dissent, when a stranger arrived one autumn evening. He appeared at dusk, just as the fog began to gather in the low places, and the lamps flickered on in windows up and down the square. No one saw him enter. One moment the street was empty, the next he was there, standing before the clockmaker's door. He wore a threadbare coat and boots scuffed raw at the toes, his only luggage a battered satchel slung carelessly over one shoulder. His face was too young to be so deeply lined, and his eyes, bright and blue as cut glass, missed nothing as he surveyed the shop front and the street beyond. He did not linger, nor did he knock. He simply let himself inside, as if he had always belonged. His name, as the town would swiftly learn, was Thomas. In another life, he might have been a poet or an engineer. In this one, he was a journeyman scholar, paid to drift from village to village in search of stories and truths. He drank deeply of the world, questioning, cataloging, seeking out the odd and the exceptional wherever it hid. He moved like someone who had spent years in motion and did not trust stillness, his manner brisk but never rude, his mind always leaping ahead to the next hypothesis. He had arrived in the town to record its customs, but what he found instead was a question so large it threatened to swallow all answers. That night, Thomas took a room at the inn, where the landlady greeted him with a smile so polished it might have been painted on. She showed him to a second-floor chamber, its bed crisply made, its curtains drawn back to frame the perfect geometry of the square below. When Thomas asked if there was anything unusual about the town, the landlady's smile grew a shade brittle, and she replied that the only thing peculiar was how little went wrong. Thomas thanked her and unpacked his satchel, spreading research notes and notebooks across the perfectly level desk. He listened to the clock in the hallway, noting how its chime was exactly synchronized to the one in his room, and how both matched the peal of the church bell outside. He slept poorly, woken again and again by dreams of gears and springs spinning faster and faster until the world itself became a blur of motion and repetition. At dawn, he rose, dressed, and began to walk the town, greeting the early risers and making silent observations. He noticed the sameness in the way people moved, in the way the dogs paced their owners or the cats watched from their sills. He made note of oddities, the perfect symmetry of the market stalls, the way school children marched to class in unison, the way the morning postman delivered letters with a precision that bordered on the obsessive. By noon, Thomas had repaired to the bakery, where he nursed a mug of strong black coffee and eavesdropped on the quiet conversations around him. He heard no gossip, no idle complaint, nothing of the petty rivalries or passions that characterized other towns he had visited. It was as if a great silence had been imposed, not by fear, but by consensus. Yet beneath the hush, he sensed something restless, a wish or a warning that had not yet found its voice. He resolved to visit the clockmaker that very evening. In the hours before dusk, he made his way along the river, following the footpath where the young couple walked in perfect step. He watched them from a distance, noting how their conversation never faltered, how their laughter chimed in harmony. He wondered what it would take to disrupt the pattern, to introduce a discordant note into the music of their lives. He wondered, too, whether the town would permit it, or if the rhythm set by the clockmaker was too strong to break. At sunset, Thomas returned to his room, bathed and changed into his cleanest shirt, and set out for the shop. The square was empty, save for the boy who had once limped and now ran circles around the fountain, his laughter echoing with regularity. The light above the shop door glowed steady and inviting, casting a pool of gold onto the stoop. Thomas hesitated only a moment, then stepped inside. He found the clockmaker at his bench, surrounded by the tools of his trade and the ticking, whispering detritus of 100 clocks. The man looked up, eyes mild but sharp, and greeted Thomas with the faintest hint of a smile. He gestured to a stool on the far side of the work table, as if he had been expecting the visitor all along. Thomas introduced himself, then explained the nature of his work, his interest in folklore, his love for the odd and the unexplained. The clockmaker listened, nodding at appropriate intervals, but volunteering nothing of his own story. When Thomas asked about the town, the clockmaker's gaze grew distant, and he replied only that he fixed what was brought to him, nothing more or less. They spoke for an hour, perhaps more. Thomas began in the manner of the tactful scholar, circling the topic with admiration and innocent curiosity. When had the clockmaker arrived? How had he learned his craft? Was there a guild, or had he inherited his knowledge from some forgotten master? The clockmaker responded with the kind of politeness that invited no intimacy, his answers brief and almost generic, as if he were reciting from a manual memorized long ago. To every probing question, he offered a story so plausible that it dissolved upon closer inspection, like an optical illusion. He hailed from the east, but offered no country. He apprenticed in the city, but declined to name its streets. Thomas was not deterred. He asked about the clocks, the mechanisms, the way each seemed to pulse with its own peculiar energy. The clockmaker smiled at this, for the first time showing a glimpse of true pleasure, and talked at length about escapements, minute gears, the delicate balance between order and entropy. He showed Thomas a latticework mainspring so fine it quivered in the lamp's breath, and described how, if assembled just so, a clock could regulate itself for centuries without intervention. It was, Thomas realized, the closest the man came to religion. The conversation ebbed and flowed, Thomas steering them back, again and again, to the mystery of the town's perfection. How did the clockmaker account for such extraordinary regularity? Did he not find it uncanny, the way no one ever grew gravely ill, or stumbled drunkenly into the river, or quarreled in the streets? The clockmaker's hands stilled at these questions. For a moment his eyes rested on Thomas with a look that was not quite suspicion, not quite longing, but some alloy of both. "Nothing stays perfect," the clockmaker said almost gently. "Not forever. But while it lasts, it should be tended." Then, as if afraid he had said too much, he busied himself with gears again, and the tick-tick-tick of his work became the only sound in the shop. When Thomas finally excused himself, the sky was black and fretted with stars. The square deserted, but for the distant flicker of a lantern in the watchman's hand. He walked slowly back toward the inn, replaying the conversation in his mind, testing each word for hidden meaning. Every window he passed was lit, every curtain drawn back in identical fashion, as if the whole town were a diagram and he but a moving dot upon it. For the first time, he felt the weight of the order pressing in, the way the hours seemed to close around him, locking him into a groove as surely as the teeth of a cog. The inn was nearly empty when he entered, the only patrons a pair of laborers nursing the tail end of their evening. The landlady greeted him with her practiced smile and poured him a glass of whatever the town considered strong. Thomas took it to a table in the corner, the better to watch the room and collect his thoughts. He had expected the peace of the town to be calming, but it had begun to feel like the hush before a storm, as if the silence itself were a living thing, hungry and waiting. He listened to the scrape of wood on wood, the muted conversation of the laborers, the distant peal of the church bell calling the hour. It was then, beneath the surface noise, that he heard it. The faint, persistent ticking, softer than breath, as constant as heartbeat. He looked for its source, scanning the mantel, the walls, even the delicate watch on his own wrist. But the rhythm was everywhere and nowhere, pervading the very air. He waited until the landlady returned to collect his empty glass, then asked, as casually as he could, if the clock in the hall was always so loud. She froze for a fraction of a second, then shook her head with a forceful little laugh. "There's no clock here, sir. You must be tired from your travels," but as she turned away, Thomas saw her fingers tremble slightly and the color drain from her face. The first thing he noticed was the sound. Even in the tavern, with mugs clinking and voices rising in laughter, he heard it. The ticking. It was faint, steady, and impossible to place. He asked the innkeeper about it, but the man only turned pale and muttered, "Best not to notice, traveler. Best not to listen." But Thomas listened. The next morning, as he walked the crooked streets, he saw the workshop, the frozen clock sign, the windows smeared with dust, and the faint glow of lamplight inside even though the day was already bright. He stepped closer, and through the glass, he glimpsed the clockmaker bent over a table. For a moment Thomas thought he saw not gears and springs in the man's hands, but something softer, redder, alive. He stood outside the shop for several minutes, watching the scene inside. The clockmaker moved with such precision that it was almost balletic. Each gesture seemed rehearsed, purposeful, as if he performed for an invisible audience. It was possible, no, likely, that the old man had noticed him. For once or twice Thomas had the distinct sensation of being observed in return. He could not shake the vision of those hands, translucent and veined, working over their tiny masterpieces. Later, when Thomas described the workshop to himself in his notebook, he found he could not decide if what he had witnessed was simply the ordinary patience of an artisan or something more sinister. He recounted the dust on the window, the impossible regularity of the ticking, the way the light fell exactly the same way at each glance, as if the scene inside the shop were itself a clockwork tableau, looping over and over. He wrote down words like hypnotic and uncanny and symmetry, then crossed them out, uncertain whether he was seeing patterns or inventing them. The second night in the inn, Thomas kept himself awake with coffee and cigarettes, determined to outlast the sound of the ticking. But it was hopeless. No matter how he tried to distract himself, the steady rattle of dice, the whispered confidences of the other guests, the sound wormed its way into every silence. He began to notice it in places it could not possibly be, in the slow drip of water from the tap, in the shuffle of cards, even in the cadence of his own pulse. At some point, half dreaming, he imagined the whole town as a single, elaborate mechanism, wound tight and running inexorably toward some appointed hour. He resolved to speak to the clockmaker directly the following day. His dreams that night were filled with the image of gears meshing and unmeshing, of hands, human and otherwise, assembling something vast and intricate in the body of the town. He woke before dawn, dressed without bothering to shave, and set off for the workshop without waiting for breakfast. The streets were empty, save for the church bell ringer who gave him a nod and a look that seemed both welcoming and warning. The workshop, in contrast to the rest of the town, was already alive with light. Thomas hesitated only a moment before knocking. Once, twice, 3 times, an accidental rhythm identical to the ticking that now haunted him. The clockmaker answered promptly, but did not invite him inside. He stood in the doorway, not blocking it, but somehow making it clear that the threshold was a boundary not to be crossed lightly. Up close, the clockmaker appeared less aged than Thomas had first assumed, though his hair was white and his face was webbed with lines. His eyes were a colorless gray, and when he looked at Thomas, he seemed to see straight through him. "May I help you?" he asked, voice thin but steady. Thomas introduced himself and explained his curiosity about the clocks, especially the one that seemed to permeate the entire town. The clockmaker listened intently, head cocked, as if even now he was measuring Thomas's words against some internal mechanism. When Thomas finished, the clockmaker gave a slight nod. "You are not the first to notice," he said quietly, "but most people prefer not to speak of it. They find it less troubling that way." Thomas pressed on, emboldened by this admission. "Is it your doing? The sound, the orderliness?" The clockmaker considered this for a long moment. "The sound is not mine, not in the way you mean. It is older than me. I only keep it in check as best I can." He did not elaborate, nor did he seem inclined to answer further questions. Thomas tried to maneuver the conversation toward the practical. What made the clocks run? What powered them? Whether there was some great central mechanism hidden in the town. But the clockmaker responded with gentle evasions, talking instead of the philosophy of time, the need for regularity, the comfort of knowing that tomorrow's dawn would come precisely on schedule. When Thomas finally left, frustrated and more uncertain than before, he realized that the ticking had grown louder. Or perhaps it was only that, in the silence of rejection, he could now hear nothing else. He spent the rest of the day wandering, observing. He followed the street sweepers as they moved in perfect formation, each step matched to the next. He watched children leap over cracks in the pavement with the same leg each time, as if rehearsed. He took a seat in the square and timed the interval between the opening and closing of each shop's door. It was always the same, down to the half-second. He made a diagram in his notebook, sketching the town as a series of concentric circles, with the church and the clock shop at the exact center. He mapped the movements of its people, their routines and repetitions, and marked with a red X the places where he detected the ticking at its strongest. It was everywhere, but always loudest at the heart of things. That evening, determined to find some respite, Thomas returned to the tavern and ordered a drink. The place was busier now, but even the laughter of drunkards failed to mask the relentless pulse. He wondered if any of the other patrons noticed, or if, like the innkeeper, they chose to ignore it out of fear or habit. He considered leaving, packing his satchel and catching the morning coach to anywhere else, but the thought repelled him. He felt as if he were on the brink of something, some grand revelation that would dissolve the whole puzzle at once. He stayed until closing, then lingered in the empty square, letting the sound wash over him until he could almost make out a pattern in it, a message that hovered just beyond the reach of language. He waited until the landlady returned to collect his empty glass. When she came, her smile was painted on thicker than before, as though she hoped the extra layer might shield her from whatever she suspected he'd seen. Thomas decided to test her composure. He leaned back in his chair, feigning exhaustion, and asked, "Does the clock in the hall always strike so loud?" "It seems to echo even in my room." The woman's hand paused mid-reach, her fingers hovering over the rim of the glass, and for a heartbeat, her face was wiped clean of expression. Then she gave a brittle laugh, louder than necessary. "Clock? You must mean the one in the square, sir," she said, almost pleading. "There's no clock in this house. Perhaps the walls are thin, or the hours have got into your head. It happens to newcomers." Her voice gained strength as she spoke, as if rehearsing a conversation she'd survived before. But Thomas noticed the glass clinked as she set it down, her fingers unsteady. When she turned, he watched her steady herself against a chair before hurrying to the kitchen, and he could have sworn the color had left her cheeks entirely. That night, fueled by a restless curiosity, Thomas prowled the shadowed corridors of the inn. He pressed his ear to the cool wood of the hallway, following the sound of ticking as it migrated through the boards, up and down the banister, as though the building itself were a hollowed-out metronome. At times he felt as though the sound receded as he approached, only to surge behind him as soon as he gave up the chase. He caught himself at one point with his hand pressed to the wall, as if expecting to feel a pulse. Sleep was a farce. When at last he drifted into it, he dreamed of endless corridors, every door opening onto another identical hallway, each lined with clocks whose hands advanced in perfect, incremental unison. In the dream, he understood that if he could only open the right door, he would find the source, the original cog, the first wheel. But with each approach to the threshold, he woke gasping as though from a fall. At breakfast, his pallor earned him a second look from the landlady, but nothing more. The laborers from the night before avoided his gaze, and the only other occupant, a woman of indeterminate years, spooned porridge with the determination of someone finishing a sentence. The ticking was still there, more pronounced in the quiet morning. Unable to resist, Thomas decided to seek answers among the townspeople. He began in the market, where vendors arranged their wares in rows as straight as a ruler, and every transaction was conducted with the efficiency of soldiers drilling. He tried to introduce the subject gently, remarking on the beauty of the town's central clock. The fishmonger, a burly man with hands chafed red as lobster shells, looked at him with mild surprise and said, "It's not the face of the clock that matters, but what's behind it." The butcher, when pressed, muttered something about precision being a blessing and a curse, then withdrew behind his curtain of sausages. It was not until midday, by the well in the square, that Thomas found someone willing to indulge his questions. An old woman, bent almost double, was filling a pail with the slowest possible motion, her every gesture as deliberate as clockwork. Thomas greeted her, offered to carry her water, and after a few pleasantries, inquired, "Forgive me, but I've heard of a clockmaker here whose reputation is unique. Is it true what they say that he repairs more than just timepieces?" The woman's face darkened at once. She glanced around, as if expecting someone to rise up from the cobblestones and report her. When she spoke, it was in a whisper so thin he had to lean in to hear. "He sees to what's broken, that one. Not just the clocks, but the people too. Or so it's told." She tapped her chest, right above her heart. "They come to him when nothing else will set them right. But the work leaves a mark." "A mark?" Thomas prompted, pulse racing. She nodded, and for an instant met his eye. "Not on the skin, but inside. They say he takes away what makes you restless, anxious. But when you come out of there..." The old woman's gaze drifted to the clock tower, looming over the square. "You don't worry anymore. Not about anything, not even yourself." She pulled her shawl tighter, though the day was mild. "They say he did it to himself first. Now he's empty, but for the ticking." Thomas tried to laugh it off. Small towns, strange stories. But the chill stayed with him even as the sun climbed higher. He watched the woman shuffle down the street, water pail swinging in perfect rhythm, neither spilling nor sloshing. When she reached the end of the block, she looked back once, met his gaze, and then vanished around the corner. That evening, Thomas returned to the inn determined to learn more, if only to dispel the fog of superstition. He took his meal at a table near the laborers, and after a glass or two struck up a conversation. The men were reluctant at first, but the promise of a free round loosened their tongues. "Stranger, it's like this," said the younger of the two, his voice hushed despite no one else being near. "The clockmaker, he's done right by plenty of folk. Fixed up old hands, set right the minds of those who'd gone strange." He tapped his temple, then shrugged. "But the ones who go to him too many times, they don't come back quite whole. As if he's wound them so tight, there's nothing left but the turning." The older laborer, whose face was cross-hatched with scars, snorted. "Don't listen to him. Those stories are just to scare children. The real trouble's the mayor. She's the one who keeps everyone marching to time." But Thomas caught the glance the old man darted at the clockmaker's shop, plainly visible through the fogged window, and knew the legend ran deeper than he let on. That night, unable to sleep, Thomas paced the silent streets. The ticking seemed louder now, advancing in lockstep with each footfall. He turned a corner and found himself facing the clock shop. The windows were dark, save for the faintest bluish glow, and yet Thomas felt watched, as if the eyes of every clock inside were trained on him. He pressed his hand to the door, half expecting it to swing open or resist, but it held fast. He bent to peer through the smudged glass. Inside, the darkness was nearly absolute, but something about the arrangement of shadows suggested 100 faces, all tilted toward the door, all waiting. He returned to the inn with the sense of a puzzle tightening around him, And still, in the heavy silence of midnight, the ticking persisted, lining up with the beat of his own heart. The next morning, determined to break the hold of the mystery, he resolved to collect more stories, to map out the shape of the rumor. He buttonholed the baker, the station master, even the school teacher, each time receiving the same half-answers, the same reluctance to speak plainly. Always there was the sense of an invisible hand guiding the town's rhythm, the suspicion that to fall out of step was to invite disaster. After dinner, by the warmth of the inn's small fire, Thomas finally cornered the landlady. She'd tried to avoid his gaze all evening, but when he asked quietly and without preamble, "Do you trust him?" she set down her tray and sat across from him. "There's nothing to be afraid of if you keep to yourself," she said after a long pause. "But if you lose your way, if you let yourself fall behind," her voice faltered, "he can fix you. Only after that, you'll never remember what it was like to be lost." Thomas tried to sleep, but the tales of the day, the relentless ticking, and the rumors of the clockmaker arranged themselves into an architecture of dread in his mind. The walls of his room seemed thinner as the night deepened. Every sound from the street below felt amplified and urgent, as if somewhere in the dark, a mechanism was winding itself toward detonation. He lay on his back and counted each tick as it crept up the stairs and along the eaves, perilously close to the hollow at the base of his throat. Each time he closed his eyes, he found himself inside the skeleton of some vast machine, a network of gears and springs flexing with every anxious breath. Even his own heart seemed to keep time with the clock in the square, sometimes matching its rhythm, sometimes lagging, as if the organ itself were resisting being conscripted into unity. He drifted in and out of restless sleep, dreams coiling tighter each time he surfaced for air. In one dream, he stood at the edge of the town with a mob of clockwork men, each with faces blank as watch dials and movements too smooth to be entirely human. They marched in perfect cadence toward the center of the world, where a tower rose like the hand of a god, clawing at the sky. Thomas tried to shout a warning, but his lips were fused, and his thoughts ran backward, a stuttering tape loop. In another dream, he wandered the labyrinthine corridors of the inn, the doors multiplying behind him with each step, and each door he opened led to the same room, the same bed, the same window through which the clock face glared like an unblinking eye. Near dawn, drenched in sweat, Thomas jolted awake to the sensation of a presence at the foot of his bed. He snapped upright, but found nothing there, only the impression of weight on the mattress, as if someone had stood watch while he slept. He swung his legs onto the floor and buried his face in his hands, trying to rub the sleep from his vision. But when he looked up, he saw on the wall above the wash basin a faint outline, the shadow of a clock's hands, projected by nothing. He traced it with his finger, half expecting the phantom gears to resist his touch, but the wall was cold and inert. He dressed without thinking, his hands moving automatically, as if guided by an external rhythm. Downstairs, the inn was deserted. Not even the landlady stirred in the kitchen, and the chairs in the common room were stacked on tables, legs in the air like the upended limbs of insects. The absence of human noise made the ticking more powerful, a tide that filled the vacuum of silence. Thomas hesitated by the door, listening for any movement in the street, and found none. The world, for the moment, seemed to belong solely to the sound. He stepped outside. The square was empty, the air brittle with pre-dawn cold. A rime of frost blurred the outlines of the stone benches and glazed the horse trough in front of the church. The hands of the public clock pointed just shy of 6, but beneath that official declaration, Thomas could sense a second, more urgent timepiece counting down within his own bones. He crossed the square with measured steps, conscious of every echo his boots made on the flagstones. Above him, the clock tower hovered, indifferent and monumental, yet somehow he felt it watching, like the single visible eye of a predatory animal. At the well, Thomas paused. Yesterday's old woman was nowhere to be seen, but her warning remained, a hairline fracture in the glass of his resolve. He repeated her words to himself, not the repair, but the necessity of breaking. He wondered whether it was the people who were broken, or whether it was the town that had infected them. He skirted the church and made his way down the narrow avenue to the clockmaker's shop. The windows glowed with a faint blue light, as if the interior were illuminated by a trapped moon. He pressed his face against the glass and saw, inside, rows upon rows of clocks, all synchronized, hands aligned in a military salute to the hour. At the back of the shop, the shadow of the clockmaker hunched over a workbench, unmoving, as though waiting for an audience. "You must understand," the old woman by the well had whispered, "that it is not the repair that frightens us. It is what must be broken to need it." From that moment, Thomas knew he had to see for himself. Perhaps, if the stories the old woman and the townsfolk whispered were true, he had to stop the clockmaker before the entire town was wound too tight to ever breathe again. Something in him, a defiance that was not quite bravery but not entirely recklessness either, propelled him back across the fog-dampened square. He rehearsed his entry over and over, working his way through imagined confrontations, each more elaborate and perilous than the last. In some versions, he was greeted with hospitality, the mystery solved with nothing more than a cup of tea and a tour of curious mechanisms. In others, he was met at the threshold by the clockmaker's assistants, those spectral figures the children had pointed at, with their strange gait and fixed eyes. But in every scenario, he saw himself standing in the heart of the workshop, face to face with the man who had, rumor insisted, emptied himself for the sake of perfection. He waited until the clock in the tower struck 8, a chime that rattled the panes of glass in their frames and sent a shudder through the wood of the inn. Then he left his room, coat buttoned, and crossed the square as if on parade. There were no witnesses. The hour was early enough that the shops remained shuttered, and only the baker's light glowed faintly through a slatted window. The air seemed to thin as he approached, as if the clocks inside the workshop drew every breath into themselves and recycled it, metallic and stale. He stopped at the door, forcing himself to breathe slowly, deliberately. His pulse thudded unpleasantly in his ears. He read the sign over the lintel. Adams and Son, horologists since 1841. The gold paint was crisp despite decades of weather. He raised a hand to knock, but his knuckles hesitated a centimeter short of the wood. The old rumors spun through his mind, of hands reattached, of hearts that beat on borrowed time, of townsfolk who no longer remembered how to be lost. He steeled himself and knocked. There was a pause, as if the clocks had to strike consensus before permitting an answer. Then the door swung inward, slow as a tide. Thomas caught a glimpse of the shop's interior before he saw its keeper, a room so crowded with clocks that the air seemed to ripple with their ticking, their faces 100 variations on the same blank-eyed watchfulness. Floor to ceiling, clocks wall-mounted and freestanding, grandfatherly and infantile, ornate and utilitarian, brass and wood and glass. The sound was a cacophony at first, each clock beating out its measure. But as Thomas stepped inside, he realized the noise was more than the sum of its parts. There was a rhythm in the discord, a pulse that beckoned his own heart to match it. The air smelled of oil, iron, and something less familiar, a sharp tang, like copper left too long in the rain. He did not see the clockmaker at first. The shop was lit only by a row of dusty bulbs strung along the ceiling, and the shifting of shadows created the illusion of movement everywhere, as if the clocks had limbs and were inching toward him in slow procession. Thomas waited, unsure whether to call out. The door nudging closed behind him with a click that resounded through the wood like a gunshot. He heard footfalls from the room's far end, deliberate and strangely weightless. When the clockmaker emerged, he did so with the silence of one who has spent years listening for the smallest sound. He was a tall, gaunt man, his face nearly featureless, save for the small, careful mouth and the glassy eyes that reflected every glint of light in the room. His clothes were immaculate but old-fashioned, a high-collared shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbow, hands bare and pale as bone. "Good morning," the clockmaker said, as if Thomas were simply here to have a watch repaired. His voice was gentle, with a timbre that vibrated low in the chest, the way a tuning fork does before the sound escapes it. "What brings you to my door?" Thomas opened his mouth and discovered that the words he'd prepared, accusations, inquiries, demands for the truth, had fled. He managed only, "I wanted to see your work." The clockmaker inclined his head. "That is why most come in the end." He gestured to the labyrinthine aisles of ticking artifacts. "You are welcome to look as long as you wish." Thomas walked the rows, running a finger along the cases, noting how each clock's hands pointed to a different hour, some hours impossible. One displayed a 13, another had no numbers at all, only a spiral that deepened and deepened until the center vanished in shadow. The workshop was larger than it seemed from outside, each alcove more densely packed than the last, as if the collection had grown inward, crowding itself toward some unreachable singularity. Thomas found himself drawn to the back of the shop, where the ticking was less regular, more syncopated, as though the clocks in the front rooms kept time for the world, and those in the back marked hours for a different universe. He reached a workbench littered with the innards of dissected clocks, springs and gears scattered like the bones of small animals. There, he found the clockmaker again, standing perfectly still, watching him with an expression that might have been curiosity or sorrow. Thomas hesitated, then asked, "Why do they say you can fix people, not just clocks?" The clockmaker's hands moved, quick as a striking snake, picking up a gear and slotting it into a half-assembled movement. He did not look up. "A clock is only as useful as its purpose," he said. "People come to me when they no longer trust their own." The words hung in the air, heavy as lead. Thomas wondered what he had expected, denial, perhaps, or an explanation that would make all the stories seem childish. But this calm admission left him unmoored. "And when you fix them," Thomas asked, "what do you take away?" The clockmaker paused, his hands resting on the brasswork, fingers oddly gentle. "Only what is broken," he said. "But not all can bear the silence that remains." Thomas stared at the man, then at the clocks, then at his own hands, which trembled slightly. He thought of the people he'd met, the woman with her haunted warnings, the laborers whose speech stuttered in the presence of the shop, the landlady who feared losing her own memory of loss. He wondered what had brought them here, and what they'd left behind. He was about to speak again when he caught, from the corner of his eye, a movement in the mirror behind the workbench. Not a reflection of himself or the clockmaker, but of a third presence, standing just beyond the reach of the feeble light. A shape with the outline of a man, but with clock faces where its own face should be, hands spinning madly in all directions. Thomas spun around, but the figure was gone. Only the clocks remained, ticking and ticking, louder with each beat. He turned back to the clockmaker, whose eyes were fixed on Thomas with a new intensity, as if judging whether Thomas would be the next to require repair. "You must understand," the old woman by the well had whispered, "that it is not the repair that frightens us. It is what must be broken to need it." Thomas reached for the doorknob with a trembling, reluctant hand, a gesture he intended to be casual, yet even the brass fixture seemed to recoil from his touch. The chill of it lingered on his palm. He pushed the door open, expecting a bell, but the usual tinkle was conspicuously absent. The bell above shivered, yet no sound escaped it, as if the air itself refused to carry such a warning. Within, the shop was brighter than he'd anticipated, the blue-white static of a dozen dust-caked bulbs making the interior bleached and lunar. Clocks sat upon every available surface, and every clock's face gleamed like a watchful, lidless eye. The very walls vibrated with the noise of the hour. Ticking, talking, chimes, and soft whirs, a symphony of timepieces that pressed against the skull and rattled the fillings in his teeth. The clockmaker was waiting at the far end of the shop, seated at a high stool behind a narrow counter, posture so perfectly upright he might have been mounted on an invisible axle. If he had been working before Thomas entered, there was no evidence of it now. His hands, pale and elongated, rested upon the glass counter, fingers splayed as if in silent benediction. His shirt was a shade whiter than bone, the collar so rigid it threatened to draw blood, and his eyes, sharp and colorless, reflected the light in a way that made them appear luminous. He greeted Thomas with a nod so slight it might have been mistaken for the tremble of a shadow. "You hear it, don't you?" the clockmaker said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. His voice was polished, smooth, and oddly resonant, as if he spoke not with his vocal cords, but from within the hollow of a bell. The rhythm. Most people pretend they cannot. Thomas's tongue was a dry, inert lump in his mouth. He worked his jaw and managed a single nod, but his gaze darted involuntarily to the workbench behind the counter. Sprawled upon a linen cloth was an object that at first defied his expectations. Not the intricate movement of a clock or a coil of springs, but something unmistakably human. The arm that lay there was the size and shape of his own, but the resemblance ended at the skin, if it could even be called that. The flesh was unnaturally pale, almost blue with transparency, and stitched in careful, deliberate spirals that followed the lines of the musculature. Brass rods, polished to a blinding shine, peeked from beneath the skin where bones might have been, and the wrist terminated not in a hand, but in a cluster of tiny gears and ratchets, each one still and gleaming. Where veins should have traced the surface, instead, there were slender, glistening tubes, through which a dark, syrupy liquid moved with the slow certainty of molasses on a cold morning. The clockmaker lifted the arm with a delicacy reserved for holy relics, turning it over in his hands so that Thomas could see the meticulousness of the craft. He rotated the limb, and the small gears at the end jittered, clicked, and then locked into place with a shuddering sigh of release. "I repair what is broken," the clockmaker said. "Not just the things of brass and steel. People, too, can be mended." Thomas flinched, his stomach rolling. He thought of the villagers he had passed on his way here. Faces too smooth, expressions too measured, their eyes like coins that had been spent and spent again until the effigies were gone. Now, in the stark light of the shop, he could no longer dismiss the rumors as the fantasy of an isolated town. He swallowed and tried to summon the courage to speak, but his voice emerged as a ragged whisper, thin as the filament in a spent bulb. "What happens?" Thomas asked. "When you mend someone?" The clockmaker's lips curled upward, but the smile was rigid, built from habit rather than joy. He set the arm aside with excessive care, almost with reverence, and folded his hands atop the counter, as if preparing to deliver a sermon. "They stop suffering," he said. "They stop fearing. They become perfect." Thomas felt the word in his bones, the way one feels the percussion of distant thunder through the soles of the feet. He tried to look away from the arm, but his eyes snagged on the seam where brass met sinew, the spiral of stitches so tidy, so deliberate. "But aren't we meant to suffer?" he said, surprised at the sound of his own voice. "Isn't that how we know we're alive?" The clockmaker's gaze sharpened, and for a moment the air between them seemed to crystallize. "That is a belief," he said. "A convenient one, shared by those who have never known relief." He gestured to the mechanical arm again, this time with a kind of paternal pride. "You see imperfection as virtue. I see only the waste of potential." Thomas stepped back, nearly colliding with a grandfather clock whose pendulum flashed like the blade of a guillotine. The ticking in the room seemed to multiply, swelling to fill every available frequency. He pressed a hand to his chest and felt his heart drumming a desperate solo, out of sync with the mechanical pulse surrounding him. The clockmaker watched, his chin tilted just so. "You feel it," he said. "The dissonance, the inefficiency. You think you are immune, Thomas, but you are here for the same reason as all the others." He bristled at the use of his name, though he did not recall giving it. "I'm not like them," Thomas said, but even as he said it, he sensed the lie blooming in his throat. He remembered the sleepless nights, the sense of being wound too tight, the ache in his bones that no medicine could dull. He remembered the way his own hands sometimes trembled, and how he blamed the cold for what might be terror. The clockmaker loomed behind the counter, unfolding himself in segments, as if animated by invisible strings. "You are exactly like them," he said, and his words struck Thomas with the finality of a tolling bell. "But you are also different. Not every clock wants to be wound." Thomas's legs felt hollow. He staggered sideways, catching himself on a glass display case filled with pocket watches, their faces all set to the same inscrutable hour. The room spun. He was aware, distantly, of the clockmaker's approach, of the measured, gliding steps that did not disturb the dust on the floor. He wanted to leave, to run, but found himself rooted to the spot. The clockmaker reached the edge of the counter and extended a hand, palm upward, inviting but not insistent. "Do you wish to be mended, Thomas?" he asked. His voice was soft, almost kind. Thomas blinked, and in the half-second of darkness, he saw again the vision from the mirror. The faceless man, the spinning hands, the endless spiral. He remembered the old woman's warning, the fracture in his resolve, the idea that some things were meant to break. He wondered what remained after all the kinks and flaws were smoothed away. He looked at the clockmaker's hand, at the fingers so pale they seemed translucent, and felt the urge to accept. His own hands, when he looked at them, were trembling so badly he had to clench them into fists. "No," he said finally. "I don't." The clockmaker regarded him with an expression not of disappointment, but of resignation. "Not yet," he said. He withdrew his hand and returned behind the counter, movements so precise they seemed choreographed. Thomas backed away, but the shop seemed to grow larger with each step, the rows of clocks stretching out, the aisles elongating into infinity. Every footfall was muffled by the dense, expectant air. As he reached for the door, he realized the bell above was gone, or perhaps it had never been there at all. He stepped into the morning and found the world altered, brighter, sharper, but tinged with the memory of the shop's suffocating silence. The square was empty. The clock tower's hands had not moved. He stood, uncertain, and wondered if any of this was real, or if he too had begun to slip, piece by piece, into the machinery of the town. He drifted through the day in a waking trance, moving from shop to shop, unable to recall what errand he performed or how long it had taken. The routine of life, bread from the baker, paper from the newsstand, a nod to the postman, unfolded with the precise regularity of a clockwork automaton. Whenever he paused, he caught glimpses of the clockmaker's handiwork, a neighbor whose limp had vanished overnight, a child whose tears never quite reached her eyes, the landlady humming a song with no tune, her expression locked in a rictus of satisfaction. He tried, with the full force of his will, to banish the thoughts that had taken root in his mind, to convince himself that it was nothing more than suggestion, the power of rumor and imagination, a story so often repeated that it grew teeth and claws and took on a life of its own. But everywhere he looked, in every corner of this strange, wind-churned town, he found evidence of a process working quietly, relentlessly, like the shifting of tectonic plates beneath the earth. The changes were subtle at first. A limp vanishing from old Jaeger's gait, the silversmith's hunched shoulder straightening overnight, a sudden and inexplicable sharpness to the once dull gaze of the butcher's boy. It was as though the entire village was being iteratively edited, its flaws erased with the clinical precision of a proofreader's pen. No one else seemed to notice, or if they did, they welcomed it as a mercy. Thomas kept to himself after that, shrinking the orbit of his days into the narrowest ellipse he could manage. He avoided the square, the bell tower, the little shops where the employees all spoke in the same measured monotone, their smiles stretched thin and glazed with something like satisfaction. But at night, with the lights off and the window cracked to let in the chill, Thomas listened to the ticking of his own heart. At first, a wild, syncopated stutter, a rebellion against order. But gradually, night by night, he could feel it being tamed, bent to the will of some larger machinery. His heart would thud against his ribs, desperate for an exit. But then the ticking of the clocks in the landlady's parlor would seep through the floorboards, and for a few seconds, he could feel his pulse falling into step with the measured rhythm of those relentless brass sentinels. He began to dream of gears, not the cartoonish, oversized gears of schoolbook illustrations, but small, delicate ones, fashioned with the care of a jeweler and polished to a blinding, predatory shine. In his dreams, he wandered endless corridors lined with mirrors, and each reflection was a little less himself than the last. Sometimes he would see his mother, or the old woman with the creaking bones, or even the clockmaker himself, but always their faces melted away, replaced by the gleaming, lidless eyes of a clock's face. He stopped sleeping. He stopped eating, too, or at least he could not remember the last time he had tasted or wanted food. Instead, he wandered the town at odd hours, tracing the route from his lodgings to the clockmaker's shop and back again, as if he were a pendulum condemned to swing until the end of time. On these walks, he noticed new changes. The trees were pruned with mathematical precision, their branches trimmed into fractal patterns. The children played in silence, their games conducted with rigid adherence to invisible rules. Even the cats, the feral, half-wild things that used to prowl the alleys, had been tamed and sat in neat, evenly spaced rows atop the stone wall behind the apothecary, blinking in unison. One evening, as the sun warped the rooftops into silhouettes of black and gold, Thomas caught sight of a funeral procession picking its way down the main road. The coffin was small. The mourners, no more than a dozen, walked in perfect formation, their heads bowed not in grief, but in what looked like contemplation. As the procession passed, he caught the eye of one of the children. Her gaze was bright, unblinking, and so unclouded by pain that for a moment Thomas could have sworn she was simply marching to a lesson, or a game, or perhaps to her own appointment with the clockmaker. That night, he lay in bed with the pillow clamped down hard over his ears, but still the ticking came, threading through the stuffing and bone and sinew, relentless as the tide. He could not tell whether it came from outside or from the thing in his chest that was supposed to be a heart, but had now become simply a metronome, counting down the seconds until he joined the rest. He wondered, in the dead hour between midnight and dawn, whether suffering was truly necessary, or whether perfection might be a kind of mercy after all. He wondered what would be left of him if all the flaws were smoothed away. On the fourth morning after his last visit to the clockmaker's shop, Thomas stood at his window and watched the street below. The fog was thick, licking the cobblestones clean, and the world looked flattened, drained of depth and color. He saw the baker's boy walking his usual route, but his gait was now so smooth and precise that he seemed to glide rather than step. A woman in a blue kerchief, one Thomas recognized from the market as a chronic cougher, the sort who had always carried with her the sweetly rotten scent of decay, walked by with her head held high, her face locked in an expression of absolute serenity. She did not cough. She did not even blink. Thomas told himself he was imagining things, that whatever the clockmaker was doing, it was no worse than the slow, ordinary rot that afflicted every other town. Progress, after all, was a kind of violence, but it would not leave him. The vision of those still, perfected faces haunted him as he went about his day, as he wrapped himself in layer after layer of denial. Later in the afternoon, as he passed the alley beside the newsstand, he heard a noise that froze him in place. It was laughter, or at least something trying to approximate it. The sound was high and bright, but utterly without warmth. A clockwork bird, its call assembled from wires and springs, not song but simulation. He turned to look, and there at the end of the alley stood the woman in the blue kerchief, the former cougher. She was speaking to someone Thomas could not see, her hands moving in elegant balletic arcs, her eyes wide and clear as glass. She threw her head back and made the laughing sound again. But beneath it, like a watermark, he could hear the regular clicking pulse of gears. The noise rose in pitch, then terminated abruptly, as though someone had flipped a switch. Thomas ducked back around the corner and pressed his forehead to the cold brick. His own breathing sounded wrong, discordant, uncooperative. He tried to remember the voice of his father, the taste of bread crust torn free with his teeth, the heat of a fever, any sensation that might anchor him to his old self. But all that came were memories of the shop, the smell of ozone and brass, the clockmaker's hands moving with papal certainty as he declared the end of suffering. That night, unable to face the silence of his room, Thomas wandered the streets until darkness pooled at the edges of the world. He walked by the light of the moon, which reflected off the shop windows and made the clocks inside look like tiny constellations trapped in glass. He drifted toward the square, where the tower loomed like a waiting judge, its face illuminated by a ghostly, unchanging glow. For a long time he stood beneath the tower, watching the hands refuse to move, as if time itself was being held hostage. It was almost dawn when he felt the air shift behind him, and the hair on his neck lifted with animal certainty. The clockmaker was there, standing perfectly still, his silhouette sharp and featureless against the pre-dawn haze. He did not speak, but simply regarded Thomas with an expression of patient inevitability. Thomas opened his mouth to protest, but there was nothing left to say. He had already lost the argument, perhaps before it had even begun. The clockmaker approached, steps soundless, and offered his hand. Thomas hesitated, then shook his head. "No," he said, but the words sounded as mechanical and inorganic as the ticking that filled the air between them. He turned and walked away, but each stride felt measured, premeditated, as though his path had been mapped out in advance. The world around him shimmered with the promise of order, and he was powerless to resist its pull. And then, as if to prove his point, the door at the back of the workshop creaked open. A woman stepped through. Thomas recognized her from the marketplace, the one who had coughed blood into her apron only days before. Now she moved with unnatural grace, her face serene, her eyes clear. But when she smiled at Thomas, the sound that slipped from her throat was not laughter. It was ticking.